Mr. McGillivray, what comes to your mind when you see these really horrific images out of Fort McMurray?
Um, the first thing that comes to mind is the 2011 wildfires in Slave Lake, Alberta, which in many ways looked very similar to this event in Fort McMurray. But normally when a wildfire affects a community, it's just burning embers that blow ahead of the fire. But in this case, in Fort McMurray, it looks like almost a wall of fire hitting the town. So it's a little bit different than Slave Lake. And of course, Fort McMurray is a much larger community than Slave Lake was.
We were supposed to draw some lessons from the fires at Slave Lake, Kelowna before that. What do you think happened?
Well, I think after an event such as Slave Lake, we always dissect the event and put committees together and task force and do up a report, and sometimes that takes time. So there's a bit of a lag to come up with those findings, and then there's a lag trying to implement them. And in the meantime, sometimes you have changes of government, as we have in Alberta. And let's be truthful, the farther you get away from an event, people start forgetting. The people that were directly impacted don't forget, but others tend to forget. And in the case of Alberta, we had a massive flood in 2013, and kind of the focus shifted over to flood. And I think, unfortunately, we kind of forgot about wildfire.
What would you like people to think? Right now everybody's in the emergency mode. Today they're expecting another very difficult day, but in a few days from now, when things quiet down, what is it that you want people to think about?
Well, I think I want people who aren't directly impacted by this event to think, wow, this can happen to me. It's a deadly dangerous mindset to think that these events only happen to other people. And nobody wakes up in the morning thinking, oh, I'm going to be impacted by a natural catastrophe today. Everybody is shocked by it. But the unthinkable only becomes thinkable once things happen. But we want people to think about this before it happens to them. And there are real concrete measures that people can take to prevent things like wildfires from becoming disastrous. And if you start on your own private property and then speak to your neighbors and then get your communities involved, we know what has to be done. It's just a matter of doing it.
So let's talk about some of these measures. First, what as an individual, what can you do?
Well, I think it's very important to look at Canada's FireSmart program, and we think this is probably the best program in the country that people can turn to learn about things they can do to protect their properties, but also their neighborhoods and their communities as well. So FireSmart basically has 3 concentric circles, and each of those circles have actions behind them. So the first circle is around your property. So what can you do on your own property? Well, you can make sure that your property is landscaped with vegetation that's not flammable. You can do things like preventing vegetation, particularly taller bushes and shrubs and things like that, from growing right up against the house, and in particular against windows. You can ensure that trees are trimmed properly, clean up the property of what we call forest litter, so pine needles and leaves and twigs and things of that nature. This is all fuel. Don't stack your firewood beside the house. Don't put propane tanks beside your house. Don't install wood sheds right beside your house. All these things are really important, and then you start getting into things like building decks and things like that with materials that aren't flammable, and not putting flammable wood shingles on your roof, and all these sorts of things. So the FireSmart program can really direct you, draw your attention to these things, and tell you what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And then the same types of principles apply to a neighborhood and also to the broader community. And the keys there are thinning fuels, so thinning out forests of forest litter, of dead trees, of trees that have fallen down in windstorms and that sort of thing. So thinning out and getting space between trees ensures that a lot of fuel is gone. and you might still get a wildfire, but it won't be nearly as intense as it would be if you didn't do that. So FireSmart is really it. It is the best program, and we really recommend that people who live near forested areas look at it very closely. And the actions that you take aren't necessarily costly actions. They just usually take a little bit of time.
How about on a larger scale? When we're thinking about rebuilding some of these neighborhoods that have been destroyed or building new neighborhoods, how, in terms of the urban development, is there a different way of thinking about urban layout and landscaping?
I'm really glad that you mentioned that because we've been doing those things with flood management for probably 6 decades now. We've been using land use planning, for example, to get people out of floodways and floodplains. Been doing that for a long time, but they're only now starting to use those same principles for wildfire. And we've seen some actions taken in British Columbia and in Ontario, where, for example, in Ontario, the Planning Act, the Provincial Planning Act now, the statement now includes wildfire as a hazard, and makes it mandatory for municipalities to think about a wildfire when they're doing urban planning. So just basically keeping people out of the interface between built-up areas and forested areas. Really, really important, but it's only now coming around right now as one of the tools in the toolbox.
Northern Alberta, is dealing with freakishly hot weather. It's hotter in Fort McMurray right now than it is in Montreal, which is at least 1,000 kilometers south of,
Absolutely, it's twice as hot in Fort McMurray as in Toronto right now, more than twice as hot.
We know that climate change is going to make this kind of events more likely. How are we going to think about this in terms of increasing frequency because of climate change?
Yeah, I mean, you make a very good point, and there's a convergence of many things happening here. There's drastic cutbacks in wildfire science in Canada. There's aging infrastructure and equipment used to fight wildfires. There's retirements of key people in the research field. There's downloading and offloading of government. And more people living in the wildland urban interface. So then when you throw climate change into the mix, you have a very, very dangerous combination of events. One of the things that's clear is that we can't fight every fire in the future. It's not going to be possible. We have to look at the way we manage land, and that's kind of the big picture, is changing the way we manage the land. Land management in Canada has to change, and we very slowly have to change people's perception about fire as being a bad thing. Sometimes fire is a bad thing, as it is right now in Fort McMurray. But if you have a wildfire in the middle of a forested area with nobody around it, well, perhaps that fire should be left to burn. And we're going to have to come up with this new accommodation with fire. And we have to accept it a little bit more. And people who move into these beautiful areas that are next to forests, they do so because it's beautiful. They really have to understand the risk, and they have to understand that can't always just pick up the phone and call 911 and expect to be saved. So you really have to have this new accommodation with wildfire in the future. And we do have to understand that sometimes fire is necessary. There are some trees that don't propagate unless they're burnt. And also, fire in forests is not necessarily bad because it thins out the fuel and ensures that we don't have much bigger fires in the years ahead. But it's this whole idea of perceiving fire in a different way, and we're going to have to come to terms with that pretty soon because we're just not going to be able to fight every single wildfire going forward.
Now, you also touched on something very interesting, and that's the capacity, our capacity to fight fires in terms of both equipment and manpower. what would you like to see done in that area, both on the federal, provincial, and local levels?
Well, I think we're pretty fortunate in Canada in that we have a really neat system called CIFFC, where provinces help each other out. So right now, several provinces have offered up assistance to Alberta during their time of need, and that system works very well. And we also trade resources with the U.S. If they need our help, we give it, and if we need theirs, they give it. So it's very almost ingenious. It's a great system. I think we do have to ensure that everybody carries their own weight, pulls their own weight. There is a particular province in the country, and I won't name it, that has been accused of cutting back on their firefighting resources quite significantly. And the thinking is that maybe they're kind of free riding on the other provinces. So everybody has to pull their weight. But I think the way the system works now is quite good. I think we do have to be smart about fighting fires and letting some go, like they do in Saskatchewan. In northern Saskatchewan, there are fires that they just let go. They don't fight them, and we're going to have to think about that a lot. But a few years ago, all the forestry ministers in Canada, of all the provinces, and the federal forest minister met in the Yukon, and they signed the Canadian Wildfire Strategy. And everybody agreed that they would ramp up wildfire research going forward and things of this nature. And the federal government agreed to pay half of the cost of this program, the Canadian Wildfire Fighting Strategy. And after it was signed, it went up on a shelf and nothing was really done with it. And it just is sitting there to this day. And it's an excellent program. And you know, if we pulled that off the shelf and dusted it off, it would be just as relevant today as it was when it was signed a few years ago. So we really believe that we have to revisit this idea of a nationwide strategy for managing our forests and managing wildfire. And it'll be a good start, I think, to a better future for us.